Hello, everyone, and welcome to our inaugural program of the 2025-2026 year. My name is Lauren Drapala. I'm the Director of Programs at Historic Preservation Education Foundation, and it's my privilege to welcome you to our first webinar in this series. Today, we'll be discussing preserving the recent past, researching and advocating for postmodernism. Before we get started, I wanted to provide just a little bit of a background to our conversation today. HPEF has been thinking about the recent past and what it means to preserve it for 30 years now. The preservation movement since its founding has often defined itself as in relation to the distant past. So as the 20th century commenced and we had increasing pressures in development and rapid rebuilding and expansion programs, we had that gap between the present and the distant shrink over time. In 1995, Historic Preservation Education Foundation partnered with the National Park Service to host the first conference of this name, thinking critically about what it meant to engage with works of high modernism. And most recently, we hosted the PRP4 conference in Boston in March, which many of you were there to attend. And this celebrated the 30th anniversary of the conference series, as well as the 30th anniversary of our organizing partner, Docomomo US. HPEF has been involved with many projects in addition to thinking through ideas of the recent past, and a large part of this has been in providing educational opportunities to people both within the preservation field and outside of it. So part of the ways that we do this is we have two grant programs currently, the Partners in Training grants, which provide training opportunities that engage with advancing preservation technology, and Partners in Documentation grants, which support student education in recording historic structures. And this program is set up to really advance documentation through the National Park Service's Heritage Documentation Program standards, and to also meet gaps in the Library of Congress holdings. So this started really as a recent past project, looking at works of modernism that were not featured in the Library of Congress, but it's also expanded to a much broader heritage that's not featured in the current collection. Lastly, I wanted to highlight our AIA continuing education program, which currently provides free National Park Service preservation brief quizzes to anyone interested, and they're eligible for continuing education credits. So as I mentioned, this is our inaugural program. We have 3 more coming up in the year, so I wanted to highlight them here. If any of them spark your interest, please make sure to find out more information on our website at hpef.us, and you can register there probably the same way that you registered for this one. And with that, I would like to start our program and hand things over to HPEF board member Priya Jain.
Thank you, Lauren. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Priya Jain. I'm on the board of directors and the secretary of the Historic Preservation Education Foundation. I'm also an associate professor at Texas A&M University. I will serve as the moderator for our talk along with Lauren. And today we're talking about postmodernism, an architectural and design style that emerged in the 1960s and flourished through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and is perhaps one of the most controversial styles. A reaction to the austerity and formalism of modernism, postmodernism embraced ornament, color, texture, and the use of historic and pop references. As these so-called POMO buildings now become old, and I dare say historic, preservationists are divided over their love and hatred for them. Regardless, these buildings are an important part of our past and future. HPEF's Preserving the Recent Past 4 conference, held in Boston in March of this year, took POMO head-on. We had a slew of projects from across the country and the globe on this topic. Hannah Simonson from Page and Turnbull talked about a new historic context statement for POMO buildings in San Francisco. Amanda Lowlin from the Heritage Consulting Group talked about designating a POMO skyscraper in Milwaukee, while the Society of Architectural Historians Heritage Conservation Committee led a panel on recent advocacy for significant POMO buildings like the Thompson Center in Chicago, designed by Helmut Jahn and built in 1985. Recognizing the need to share stories about emerging research and advocacy for POMO, We are excited to be joined today by two excellent speakers, Andrea Goldwyn and Maxime Coq, whose talk about Michael Graves' Disney Hotel in France, that you will see today, a part of it, generated a lot of interest at the conference. So first, we have Maxime, an architect and researcher from the University of Liège. Welcome, Maxime.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Priya. I'll now try and share my slides with you, but I'd like first to thank you, Priya and Lauren, for the introduction, and I'm really glad to be here with you all to discuss Pomo advocacy at Pomo Matter today, and tonight for myself, actually. And I would like to thank the HPEF for the invitation, and especially Lauren and Priya for organizing and moderating this event, and to Andrea Goldwyn for sharing the floor with me today. And just a little parenthesis, I would like also to thank and pay special thanks to Patrick Burke, project lead who supervised the Disney projects at Michael Graves Architecture. He granted me access to all the Michael Graves archives and the material that I will show today. And we shared wonderful interviews together. And he shared so many stories on those projects that I can only be thankful to him. Now I will try and share my presentation, and let me just put this through. Hopefully it's full page for you. Priya, can you let me know if it's full page? And
yes.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. So today I'll take you through part of the story of and behind Michael Graves' Disney Hotel New York, and then I broaden the scope and expand the scope of the study to shape how it can inform the bigger picture that is postmodern architecture in the context of Disney and corporate multinationals. First, we have to go back in time and take a look at the story behind Hotel New York. And a word of caution here. There are quite a few slides, but hang on to your hats and glasses, as I'll do my best to stick with the 20 minutes limit. As someone said, a very well-known narratologist, I'll say, Walt Disney, it all started with a mouse. Well, actually, for the story, it all started with a CEO, Michael Eisner. It is in 1984 that Eisner became CEO of the Walt Disney Company, and he quite quickly brought with him his passion for the arts, design, and you've guessed it, for architecture. Speaking about the Walt Disney Company endeavor in architecture, he stated in a note to his CFO Frank Wells that if we're going to do something more than help people have a good time with Mickey, if we're going to make aesthetic choices, then we've got to upgrade the level of our architecture and try to leave something behind for others. We're not going to do schlocky architecture, and we're going to try and make a statement to make some history. In fact, in his 20 years tenure, Michael Eisner orchestrated the development of more than 70 buildings around the world, mainly postmodern, by some of the most renowned contemporary architects at the time, which would be then and afterwards labeled as postmodern, such as Frank Gehry, Arquitectonica, Venturi Scott Brown, Aldo Rossi, Charles Moore, Robert Stern, and you've guessed it, Michael Graves, whom designed for some of the most important Disney architecture endeavors, namely the Team Disney building in Burbank and the Swan and Dolphin hotels in Orlando. The one we're interested in today is the Hotel New York, the Disney Hotel New York, who was designed as part of the EuroDisney resort, which opened in Paris, north of Paris, in 1992. Located near Paris, the EuroDisney resort was one of the biggest ventures the Walt Disney Company undertook. Along with a version of the well-established Magic Kingdom, or Castle Park, as the Disney would call it, EuroDisney was to encompass an entertainment district and seven hotels. Story has it that Robert Stern, who saw the initial master plan when he had a meeting for another Disney project, harshly criticized it, and with architect in charge Wing Chao, he offered to revise the plan. This ended up in the famous hijacking of Elizabeth Macmillan's business dinner with Frank Gehry, Michael Rotundi, Stanley Tigerman, and Robert Stern himself, where Chao and Eisner convinced the architects to brainstorm on the master plan. After dropouts and drop-ins, Gehry, Tigerman, Venturi, Scott Brown Michael Graves and Stern revised the master plan over Easter weekend in 1988. Following this master plan revision, world-renowned architects were invited to partake in a famous 3-day competition in Michael Eisner's residence in Aspen to decide whom would be in charge of the building of 5 hotels bordering the lake and river and the entertainment district. Frank Gehry ended up getting the entertainment district project, obviously, while Stern, Purdock, Grumbach, and Graves, so Antoine Grumbach, Antoine Purdock, Michael Graves, and Robert Stern, were in charge of the hotels. With his experience with the Swan and Dolphin in Orlando, Michael Graves got in charge of the design of the convention hotel, saying that the Swan and Dolphin hotels were conventions hotel at the time. And all of these hotels around Lake Americana, which was called Lake Americana at the time, but then became Lake Buena Vista, were to be themed, quotation, around Americana, naming Lake of Americas. To better understand the ambitions and philosophy behind this project, the hotel that would become the Disney Hotel New York, here is a drawing by Michael Graves which depicts his vision and interpretation of New York City, and more specifically of Manhattan, already digging in a kind of narrative aspect for the project. To better understand these aspects and the ambitions and philosophy of this project, Disney's architectural projects, I'd like to look back at Beth Dunlop's Building a Dream, The Art of Disney Architecture, which is a book that was published first in 1996 and then a second edition in 2010, sorry. And look at a specific quotation that she stated after naming her first chapter, specifically Architecture with a Plot. According to Dunlop, at Disney, every architect must turn a storyteller. Which bridges for me the gap with Sebastian Gerrard's and Sylvain de Blekker's recent narrative architecture book, A Designer's Story, making an explicit link between these projects and narrative ambitions in architecture. With that in mind, let's take a look at Michael Graves' Hotel Disney New York and the ambitions behind its narrative. At first, the hotel was to be themed around the idea of the big American metropolises. Here is a 1988 preliminary site and character study showing Michael Graves' typical addition of so-called neighborhoods, which were articulated around the lake and the site plan, and just to the left of it, which is pretty close to the end result, actually. All articulated around that specific Lake Americanas at first. The lake-facing facade already bared the idea of a central vertical tower-like structure composed of vertical elements referencing the idea of a skyline, and 2 articulated lateral wings on each side of this central element, reminiscent of the high-rise of metropolises. By July 1988, the layout of the hotel was nearly set with a central vertical element, still that specific element of verticality, and dialoguing with the lake. By that time, the concept was still to depict the idea of high-density American metropolises and to pay tribute to the most famous American cities, such as in these preliminary interior design studies of hallways that would be dedicated, among others, to Memphis, St. Louis, Kansas City, and New York City. After discussions with the Walt Disney Company, the narrative shifted to become a more literal reinterpretation of a specific city, New York. The Metropolis Hotel thus now became the Hotel New York, shifting the narrative once more. However, design intentions that had mainly been in place since 1988 remain, and only to evolve towards a clarification of the hierarchy between the parts, the central element being more prominent and underlining the idea of skyscrapers, like we would have known through the idea of metropolises, and going back to the first design that was suggested in 1988, and a rearrangement of the disposition of some namables, as called for micrograves, namely the swimming pool volume with its inverted pitch roof pushed back near the parking lot. This led to the final drawings bearing the overall New York City narrative, even in the denomination of the hotel's different wings, referring to famous Manhattan neighborhoods. Midtown Tower housing the entrance and lobby on the ground floor, the brownstone wing housing the restaurants on the ground floor too, Gramercy Park wing logically housing hotel rooms, and the downtown athletic club holding the swimming pool and fitness center. Finally, this whole Manhattan narrative was anchored with a reflection pool and a pocket park at the lake-facing entrance called, and referring to, Central Park, which is the archival drawing that we can see over here. I'll now go through a series of pictures of the delivered project in 1992 on opening day, this being the overall view of the hotel from the opposite side of the lake. Here we have the Gramercy Park section with a patio and park, little pocket park as well. The entrance and Central Park pool and the brownstone wing in the back. Here's a drawing of the hotel's floor design, anchoring the New York City narrative through nods to the Yankees on one side and the Giants on the other side, and allusions to New York City's nickname, the Big Apple, with literal Big Apple artwork embedded in the floor, and we will see it later in various design pieces. The lobby showcased a typical Grecian vocabulary, with those cylindrical columns and rectangular lintels or beams. The namables, once again. The New York City storytelling devices even went as far as mural designed by Michael Graves himself depicting New York City moments, such as this mural depicting the New York City subway, for which we can see a picture over here. Other narrative design elements were these skyline murals designed for the main ballroom, and again those big apples threaded in the carpet floor. Finally, the Big Apple narrative even infiltrated the culinary experience, with the restaurant being named Parkside Diner and exploring the idea of American diners, even in the design. Finally, the guest rooms themselves, designed by Michael Graves as well, really embedded both the narrative ambitions of the hotel and the diner's mock and own narrative style. Perhaps one of the most recognizable elements, or at least one of my absolute favorite of all, is the Empire State Lamp, because it can thus be seen as a synecdoche of the overall design intentions of the project. Sorry, but the word synecdoche is so simple in French, but so complicated for me in English. This Empire State Lamp is truly Michael Graves in its design. The namables, the squares, the color palette, but it also truly embeds the overall hotel narrative of New York City. It both embodies the language of Michael Graves, figurative, playful, metaphorical, with the namables and the color palette, as well as the story he is telling, which is the Art Deco golden age of New York, specifically of Manhattan, within the hotel realm. But to better understand the implication of such narrative objectives, let's call upon a French literary theorist, Gérard Genette. Genette was one of the first to theorize narratology as a branch of knowledge in his seminal works, Figure 3, and then in Nouveau Discours du Récit. Borrowing on his theories and transposing them in the field of architecture, we can thus consider the Disney Hotel New York, which is the architectural project, right, as a narrative. Michael Graves would then be a narrator of this narrative, and New York City would be the story that is being narrated. Looking at the project through this lens clearly shows that part, and perhaps the big one, of the value of this project lies in its narrative ambitions and intentions. To further encore this assumption, applying Jain's narratological tools helps us understand the specific role of the narrator in this case. Graves is a homodiegetic narrator, meaning that he himself is part of the story, and he can be recognized in the design of this building. The diegetic is the story, the diegetic level is the story. And it is not only a narrative about New York City, but also a narrative about Michael Graves. He is present in every aspect and recognizable just as he is in the lamp with all those elements so typical of his design and language. He is present in the story and he's the one narrating it. Now, for the sake of comparison, and as a nod to my PRP4 presentation, which I intended to modify a bit more, but then I remember that it was a core anchor of the presentation. The Disney Hotel New York was transformed and reopened in 2021 under the name of Disney's Hotel New York, The Art of Marvel. Here's a side-by-side comparison of the facades. With the most noticeable change is the color palette, which doesn't bear Michael Graves' pastel colors anymore, but rather a stark, much grayer color palette reflecting the Marvel new theme. In place of Michael Graves' reflecting pool, and specifically his mural alluding to Manhattan and New York City, with all the landmarks being depicted in mosaics, there now lies a patch of lawn, which is a literal reference to Central Park, whereas with Michael Graves, we had kind of an allusion to it. The most dramatic changes might be inside, however. The typically Gravesian lobby and Pomo-esque architecture gave the way to a contemporary-looking, stark and sleek new lobby, better showcasing the Marvel universe, but taking away the original New York City narrative, and with it, the narrator. References to the Met, for example, gave way to grayish hallways lined with Marvel artworks. Finally, to circle back to our guest rooms, the new design stays in line with the other changes, sleek, contemporary looking, and absent of any evidence of the narrator itself. Now let's focus, as we did with Michael Graves' iteration of the hotel, on the synecdochic element that is the lamp, in lieu of the Empire State Lamp. Serious, sleek, contemporary, literal, Marvel color scheme is the new narrative which narrates a new story, that of a hotel dedicated to Marvel and to contemporary New York. This radical narratological change also has an effect on the definition of the narrator itself. No longer present or embodied in the story, the narrator is now standing outside of it, and as Jeanette puts it, constitute a heterodiegetic narrator, a narrator who lies outside of the narrative. This narrative transformation or replacement not only drastically changes the architecture in its form, but also in its essence and in its core design intentions. If modern architecture's value may lie in its conceptual intention, then postmodernist architecture's value might lie in its narrative intentions. With these narrative considerations in mind, concerning Michael Graves' Disney Hotel New York, and circling back to all architects who work for the Walt Disney Company, one might ask the question and the overarching theme that helped bring together all these architects. Is it narratives? And in this regard, Heinrich Klotz's The Story of Postmodern Architecture provides an enlightening theory on postmodern architecture itself. In his 1988 English and second version of the book, Klotz insisted that architecture is fiction, and that, I quote, "Today we are in the process of liberating architecture from the abstraction of pure utility and restoring to it the potential of making invented place possible again." Such parallel helps us come to the conclusion that indeed postmodern architects and the Walt Disney Company might have found common ground in a specific design intention that is narrative, or the storytelling as the Walt Disney Company puts it. Meaning that if we do accept that narrative and fiction might be an essential value of those postmodern buildings, then the Walt Disney Company might have worked with postmodern architects because their values and intentions aligned. Finally, circling back to Gérard Genet's narratological theories and applying them to postmodern architecture would help us organize the different narrative levels, the diegetic levels, the levels of the stories, embedded within this project and better understand each of them. First, the diegetic level, the realm of the story, the one we've been discussing so far. It is here that the project and the narrative manifests itself, better understood through the lens of narratology, for example. Then, the meta-diegetic level, where the stories are the stories within the stories, stylistic allusions and references so typical of Pomo architecture, and better understood through the lens of Jain's double coding, or Venturi's both and, or even theories of intertextuality within the realm of literary theories. Then there is the extra-diegetic level, which is the author's level, where the designer's intention lies, the voice of the architect. Architects translate Disney apparatus into architectural form through this level. This level is, I think, the mediating point between the project and the final level, which is the extra-textual level. This level encompasses all impositions and real-world constraints on the narrative or the project. Here lies constraints and systems, clients, corporate mandates, the Walt Disney Company, for example, contracts, intellectual properties, bureaucracy, press management, and so on. The extra-diegetic level and the designer-author-narrator thus plays a key role mediating these aspects, influences, impositions, and finally land in the diegetic level and influences the project. Studying postmodern architecture through these different lenses might help us give a better understanding of it. Not merely studying it as solely a style of architecture, but also where the strategies of creation of postmodern architecture lies, defined by Sylvia Levin as the postmodernization effect. She distinguishes postmodernization, a process, from postmodernism, a style. Postmodernization is about the discipline, how the discipline reorganized itself in response to changing conditions of production and reception, which perfectly fits the brief within this corporate Walt Disney realm. All in all, Janet's theory could be better considered as a theoretical and methodological framework which helps map the different historiographical realms that can help better understand postmodern architecture at various narrative levels. And in true cartoonesque fashion, that's all folks.
Thank you, Maxime. That was fantastic. And the New York lamp in your backdrop makes a lot more sense now. Before we move forward, I wanted to remind the audience to submit any questions they have for our speakers using the question and answer button at the bottom of your screens in Zoom. So moving on to our next talk, we have Andrea Goldwyn, who is the Director of Public Policy at the New York Landmarks Conservancy. Welcome, Andrea.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you so much. Let me just get my screen going. We can start. Okay, and Priya, can you confirm that you can see this okay?
Yes,
Great.
yes, I can.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, hello again. I'm Andrea Goldwyn. I'm the Director of Public Policy at the New York Landmarks Conservancy. The Conservancy is a private nonprofit that works primarily in New York City. We provide financial and technical assistance to building owners, and we also advocate for individual landmarks and historic districts. We'll be talking today, of course, about POMO. As me and my colleagues were working on this, we had a lot of fun with puns, so I included one in the title. Oh no, it's POMO. But it was a pretty serious situation, our advocacy for New York City's postmodern architecture. We'll get started. So we became very involved in this a few years ago, along with some of our colleague groups. And I think some of my colleagues are actually in this Zoom, so hello. We became very involved in this when a new owner took over 60 Wall Street. This is the well-known tower by Kevin Roche and John Dinkeloo back from 1988. It features this fabulous lobby, which is a hallmark of the postmodern style in New York City. And the building's new owners were making plans to change it into this attractive but somewhat, much less interesting lobby space. In New York City, for people who are not familiar, the Landmarks Preservation Commission is the city agency that designates and regulates our landmark buildings. An interesting fact about New York's landmarks infrastructure is that buildings only need to be 30 years old for designation here. So unlike a lot of places in the States that follow the National Register of Historic Places with its 50-year timeline, we have a much shorter period that we can look back on. And this creates some really interesting tensions, because I think a lot of people who were familiar with with 60 Wall Street might have remembered when it was being built, might not have had the same kind of warm feeling towards it, because it was a very dramatic building when it opened. But this version of the lobby really gave a lot of people pause. With our colleagues, we embarked on a campaign to get the building designated. There was a lot of back and forth. We had a lot of support from the local council member, which is very important in these situations. Just to note, the commission does not need owner consent for designating, but they like to have political support and potentially owner support. Unfortunately, the lengthy back and forth between the Conservancy and our fellow advocate groups and the council member and the Landmarks Commission ended in this letter, which was sent out about 2 years ago. And I will have highlighted the important and kind of surprising part. Sometimes the commission, when they reject a designation, will just say, we'll take it under consideration. But they expanded a little bit more here. They said, because postmodern architecture has only recently reached the age of eligibility, the commission needs to fully understand the significance of the era and relative merits of individual buildings. And we found this all very surprising, that they would suggest that there was not a strong foundation for understanding postmodernism, since the commission had designated the AT&T building, now known as 550 Madison, back in 2018. When that building also had new owners and was under a threat for changes that would have significantly diminished the kind of most interesting postmodern qualities. And they had also designated the interior of the UN Plaza, the United Nations Hotel at UN Plaza, including the Ambassador Grill and the lobby, when again, change in ownership was prompting the potential for changes to these great postmodern interiors. So responding to what the commission had put out there, that there was sort of not a good understanding of postmodernism, the Conservancy undertook a campaign to raise awareness of postmodernism, to get more people to be paying attention to. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot this one. There was also a lot. We've also been experiencing losses in postmodernism. The fabulous Takashimaya storefront on Fifth Avenue. The building is still there, but as you can see, it was altered in 2014. It's a perfectly fine facade, but kind of has lost some of its enthusiasm. So the Conservancy undertook this campaign. We started, as all things seem to, with some words from Bob Stern. He had done a talk about postmodernism and came up with a list of buildings. And I think what we've all found talking about postmodernism is that there are many aspects to this style because it goes back into history and brings it forward. Postmodernism can look different in a lot of ways. So we thought, well, a Bob Stern list is as good a place to start as any. And we took his list and we created a social media campaign where we put out a pair of buildings I think it was every other week for a few months, and talked about the value of postmodernism to the city, talked about specific buildings, and tried to elicit some interest in this style. As I said earlier, with this 30-year look back, I think you can kind of run into an obstacle that if people remember when a building opened, it's sometimes hard for them to remember that maybe now it's historic, that it fits into a context of architectural history, and that it has a place within that context that's different from maybe their own experiences of it and what they saw when it opened. I once had a colleague, a board member who was an older gentleman, and we were looking at a really fantastic mid-century modern building that I recognized, as a classic of that era, a fantastic landmark. And he kind of scowled and said, like, well, I remember when it opened, that can't be a landmark. So with that in mind, we were trying to get kind of more enthusiasm for this style and its place in the city. So just to go through, this is what one of our examples looked like. And then at the end of the time, we compiled the buildings that got the most interest on our emails, on Facebook, on Instagram, on all our socials. And we gathered up the top 10 of these buildings and compiled a report that we've shared with the Landmarks Commission. And I just thought I would go through some of these examples to show you the real range of postmodernism in New York and the range of responses that we've got, the range of ways that this style engages with the city. So working backwards, we've got number 10 of our original list had about, I think, 30 or 32. These are the top 10. So the Worldwide Plaza in Midtown, it's an SOM building from 1989 that was likened to Rockefeller Plaza as a block-shaped, block-sized residential and commercial complex. A 45-story office tower and 38-story apartment complex that looked back at the styles from the 20s. The comments that we got and really kind of hit all of these notes. People said, these classically inspired postmodern skyscrapers offer a rare design for late 80s buildings and are a prime example of engineering and urban planning, superbly designed and proportioned in a setting that's sympathetic to the human scale. The next one, a very different kind of building, a residence at 110 East 64th Street. And I'll just note, most of these are in Manhattan. I think only 2 or 3 or 4 were outside of Manhattan. So this residential building is in between buildings of 2 very different styles. There is Central Presbyterian Church, which you can see to the right, and the Asia House to the left by Philip Johnson. And this building kind of negotiates between those 2 styles. And I think that's what was very attractive to people. We heard that it was an elegant solution to the infill townhouse typology, done with Upper East Side politeness and discretion, but clearly headed elsewhere. And many of these are very different kinds of buildings, all with that postmodern ethos. The Islamic Cultural Center, another SOM project on 3rd Avenue, a postmodern interpretation of the Islamic tradition of geometric ornamentation, which is also, for New York, very interesting, rotated 29 degrees off the grid to face Mecca. This building got a great response. It was called A Pioneering and Bold Break with New York Architecture, a magnificent structure that suddenly appears along East 96th Street. Another very different style. This is the U.S. Courthouse Annex by KPF from 1994, built to align with Cass Gilbert's U.S. Courthouse, and the New York County Courthouse from the 20s and 30s. This building uses materials and fenestration to tie in with those other historic court buildings. Moving back into Midtown, the Four Seasons Hotel, an IMP building from the early 90s. It was apparently New York's first super luxury hotel since the Waldorf Astoria from 1931. A building that attracted a lot of attention when it first opened. Interestingly, the Waldorf Astoria was recently converted to mixed hotel and condo use, as the Plaza was a few years ago. I believe the Four Seasons is still primarily a hotel use. Now we have two very different kinds of buildings that reflect the way postmodernism reaches out into different styles and brings them into the present with varied effect. This is the Dana Discovery Center. Oh, excuse me. This is the Ballfields Cafe in Central Park by Buttrick, White, and Verdes from 1990. And as you can see, this building uses very clear allusions to historic buildings in the park, to the Calvert Vaux buildings that Central Park is known for. But I think what people really responded to was that, like those historic Calvert Vaux buildings, it's absolutely charming. We had people say that this great example of postmodern picturesque helps to preserve an example of the movement for historical reference. See, and the previous one, the Dana Discovery Center, built in the same era in the 90s when Central Park was being revitalized. And I think you see a theme of a lot of these buildings are from that era in New York, just after the city was nearly bankrupt, when there was new investment in the city. And there was also a lot of innovation. People were kind of going for broke, doing whatever they could to revitalize the city. And I think these two buildings are great examples. They were built as Central Park was receiving new kinds of investment, revitalization. The entire park, which had fallen on some hard times, was being restored back to the great jewel that it is today. And so this is another one of these postmodern follies, we'll call them, which features a number of historicized elements that relate directly to other buildings in the park. Another kind of building, again, this is the Museum of TV and Radio back in Midtown, Philip Johnson and John Berge. This is a building like the Four Seasons that looks back to tradition and classicism using limestone as a material that relates to historic antecedents. One person noted, in a sea of glass curtain wall skyscraper facades, it's grounding, stabilizing, and refreshing to see one that is not. And then rounding out our top 10, coming in at number 2 was 60 Wall Street, the building that started this all. And I think a number of us who were involved in this were really heartened to see that so many New Yorkers responded so well to this beautiful lobby and the classical elements of the facade. The comments included its stunning examples of this era's architecture, one of the most distinguished Pomo towers in the city, and arguably a better work of architecture than AT&T. Very few architectural trends are seen as timeless in their own time, which kind of brings us back to that tension of looking back on something that you remember so well. And one person wrote, and I'm not sure what this means, but I love the comment, good for the New York City paella of buildings. Unfortunately, while the exterior is still intact and there are going to be some minor alterations, the lobby has been demolished. I was over there last week just to get a sense of what was happening there. And there's still a passageway to a subway entrance in the lobby, but the lobby as we knew it is mostly gone. And besides kind of the loss to history, I think what we felt and what my colleagues felt was that the owners were really missing an opportunity to have something interesting and unique that would hopefully attract tenants to the building. The plan that they have, like I said, it's fine, but there's nothing else that looked like this. So a real loss and hopefully an inspiration as we move forward. But finally, the number one building is in our survey is the Lipstick Building, the office tower in Midtown, another Philip Johnson building. We described it as a 34-story ellipse-shaped tower sheathed in bands of red polished granite and stainless steel that gets its name from the telescoping upper floors that instantly likened to lipstick emerging from its canister. I think this building was far and ahead the number one building that attracted attention and that people would like to see designated. They called it an iconic building that represents a unique style of postmodernism with extraordinary use of color and such an identifiable shape. It is the epitome of New York City wisdom, the stuff of legend that keeps people excited to say they live here. So that concludes our list of buildings, and we are hopeful that working with the Landmarks Commission, we can bring forward this idea that postmodernism is a historic style that needs to be represented in the pantheon of landmark buildings. And here's the full list. We have New York Loves Pomo. Oh, and I just wanted to add, besides these buildings that are, so fantastic, and many of them kind of well known, we're happy to say that postmodernism is reaching out beyond Manhattan. This is a church in Queens that one of my colleagues came across in a survey. They submitted it to the State Historic Preservation Office, which has determined that it is eligible for National Register listing. So happy to see that postmodernism is finding its place in the pantheon of great New York City buildings. And with that, I will stop my share.
Thank you, Andrea. That was wonderful. I just wanted to remind folks again that if you have questions for our speakers or comments, feel free to add them. We don't have a traditional chat button on Zoom, but we do have questions and answers, and we'd be happy to share those comments and questions publicly if you submit them. But I just maybe perhaps to start us off, I mean, again, both the talks were so rich. I thoroughly enjoyed them. And I was struck by the recurrent theme of the interiors of these buildings being so rich and critical to the design of the buildings. And it was unfortunate because I was hoping there was going to be a redeeming, kind of aha moment at the end with the Roche and Dinklew building, that they did, in fact, save it. But alas, that didn't happen. And it seems like another building you pointed out, the AT&T building in New York, Andrea, I think the same story happened there, that the lobby was not, in fact, saved.
Yeah, the lobby had been altered over years. One thing that's interesting about these buildings, and I kind of alluded to it, that it was in a time when New York was having a lot of experiments. A lot of new planning tools were coming into play with these buildings, and both AT&T building and 60 Wall Street utilized a benefit called a privately owned public space, where they attained additional zoning bonuses. So they could make their buildings bigger to have a lobby that was a public space. And so that's kind of one of the reasons we became involved in this, is because of that status as a POPS, as it's called. But yes, the lobby at AT&T had been altered over the years, but was still largely intact. There was also an outdoor space that had been altered over the years. Both of those were changed with the consent of the Landmarks Commission. The designation was primarily exterior, but they do have review of the interior as well. Unfortunately, in 60 Wall, I mean, I think you could say kind of the most significant aspect of the building was that lobby. so unique, so compelling. And we even went to the developers and said, you've got this great opportunity. This is an asset, don't throw it away. And unfortunately, as people know, sometimes in New York, things just keep on changing.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Maxime, I was wondering if you wanted to jump in with, this the interiors of the hotel. It seems like they were also completely changed in this case, spurred by the Age of Marvel, the new renovation. Mm-hmm.
Yes, totally. And I think it's a recurring issue, perhaps, with postmodern architecture is that some of the designers really designed it like a gesamtkunstwerk. And mainly, I mean, we have those Disney projects really facing forward that problem because Michael Eisner really asked all of the architects to design the interiors. It was a very specific demand from his part. So nearly all of the buildings that he had designed by postmodern architects were also designed with the interiors. So all of these buildings are potentially losing a huge part of the narrative, let's say.
Right.
And if I can just jump onto something is that I was really impressed about how the public opinion seemed to actually really change in New York. And I'm like, I do not see that happening in Europe, not for now. And yeah, I mean, it's perhaps in Britain, but not in, for example, in Belgium, it's not happened yet. It's still being, postmodern architecture is still being looked at as something that should be changed. And I thought that these narratives that were brought up by the public were really interesting. Actually, I think it's something I was surprised and interested in.
Yeah, it's really great. As I said, the Landmarks Commission does not need consent from the owners, but having agreement with the owners, and even more importantly, having political support, which comes from the public, is key. And so that was one of the things we were trying to foment with this campaign.
That's great. Yeah, and just to close the conversation, I think from my thinking about the interiors, it was interesting to me the comment that they said that the interiors are rarely landmarked, and that of course has been an issue. But what we have seen with advocacy and the restoration and renovations of modernist buildings, the belated appreciation of the interiors in those buildings and how critical those were, and they have been restored in recent projects. So to me, it seems that's a story that we have kind of seen play out. And it would be nice to be proactive with these next round of buildings where the interiors seem to be super important as well. And perhaps going to have zones within the buildings, perhaps the lobby and main areas, could be the highest preservation zone. And that's, again, a tool that we have within a preservation work, but it might help some of these buildings. I'm looking at the time. I think we have 5 minutes. So again, a shout out to folks. That seems like there is a question. There is a question for Andrea from Brinda. Gaitonde Nayak. And the question is, are there any POMO buildings near Central Park? And does that affect in any way with CP being in the world, with Central Park being in the World Heritage Sites tentative list? So the question is, are there any POMO buildings in Central Park? And do they come in the way of the fact that Central Park is on the World Heritage Sites list?
Yeah, so 2 of the buildings, the little kind of historicized buildings that were reminiscent of the Calvert Vaux buildings, those are in the park. Central Park is a scenic landmark already, a New York City scenic landmark, which means that the Landmarks Commission has review of any changes to buildings in the park. It's a slightly different kind of review than the review of most buildings, but they would oversee any changes. Those 2, the 2 that I showed there are a few other kind of POMO influence buildings, but I think those are the ones that have attracted the most attention.
Thank you for that. And I think to close on that, I was also struck, Andrea, in your presentation by the diversity of POMO styles. The buildings in the park are so different from the classical revival styles that I think most people associate with postmodernism. So again, that is both, I think, and really a challenge for postmodernism to kind of how to define this eclectic style, but also that makes it so much more diverse and interesting. And I also wanted to point out the Islamic Center that you had, because we, in our conference in Boston, had a tour of the Islamic Center in Boston, in Roxbury. And it's interesting how many of these buildings, especially built by new immigrants after the 1965 Immigration Act. So a lot of these FOMO buildings are also from that time period, and hence are able to speak to that aspect of American history as well.
Yeah, and I think that church that I showed at the end, that's in Queens, that's not a high style building, that doesn't have a well-known architect, that speaks to exactly the point that you're bringing up. So hopefully beyond even these kind of iconic buildings, there's a whole range of buildings out there that represent this style.
Thank you. I see Lauren. I think it's time for us to close or get close to closing.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you both so much for joining us for this conversation. I think we just scratched the surface of something that we'll probably spending the next couple of decades trying to make sense of. But I just wanted to add for my own, I think it's really exciting to be thinking about what we lose when these places are changed. I commend you both for doing the work of documenting these places and telling their stories because I don't think we know the full ramifications of what we lose as a society or what we gain through changing them, both sides of it. I know that Maxime is leading the charge this semester with a course of students at University of Liège looking directly at postmodernism. And so I look forward to seeing what comes out of your course, Maxime. And Andrea, as always, keep up the good fight in in New York. We have many treasures here that we want to see continue into these next decades. So thank you both for joining us. And for everyone that's signing off, just make sure that you follow what we're doing at HPEF. We have our upcoming events. We're on social media on Instagram at HPEF_US. So look forward to seeing you at future events. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.